Viewed from a distance of nearly a century, they don't seem as heroic as they really were. They had funny names, repaired bicycles, and wore three-piece suits to the beach. To the modern eye, they look more like comedians than leading men. But they invented the science of aeronautics, thinking in 3 dimensions when the rest of the world couldn't move beyond 2. They made human flight possible, and every aircraft that has ever flown owes at least something to their work. They are Orville and Wilbur Wright, and they are legends of air power. Wilbur, the older of the Wright brothers, was born April 16, 1867, on a farm in Millville, Indiana. Orville, his younger brother, came along 4 years later. Their father was Milton Wright, a bishop of the United Brethren Church, who could not drive a nail straight into a board. It's really no surprise, then, that the Wrights attributed their engineering aptitude to their mother, Susan Kerner Wright, a shy woman who happily assisted them in the design and construction of numerous childhood projects. For all their similarities, the Wright brothers also were a study in contrasts. Wilbur was so shy as to be almost silent in public. He seemed truly happy only when dismantling something mechanical. Orville, on the other hand, was relatively impulsive. He was the idea generator, always coming up with the next project, and something of a dandy. Together, the two formed a well-balanced whole. Orville brought passion and energy, Wilbur persistence and determination. The Wrights' tinkering was accompanied from a very young age by a strong entrepreneurial streak. Orville built kites and sold them to classmates. Wilbur, who worked for the publisher of a church newspaper, invented a machine that automated the folding of papers for mailing. The family moved from Indiana to Dayton, Ohio, where Susan Wright died of tuberculosis in 1889. Wilbur, the dutiful son, nursed her to the end. In 1892, the Wrights opened the Wright Cycle Company to build, repair, and sell bicycles. The business grew quickly, and the seasonal nature of the bicycle business in Ohio afforded the Wrights long winters to experiment. The late 1800s were a boom time for invention. New technologies changed nearly every aspect of life. Improved furnaces and electrical generators made possible household electrification. Wireless telegraphy foreshadowed radio and television. The first practical adding machine served notice of the coming computer age. And the first automobiles appeared on roads previously trod only by horses. But the really big engineering challenge, the problem so daunting that many thought it unsolvable, was heavier than air flight.
Well, Wilbur was the oldest of the two, and he was the one who actually came up with the idea of trying to solve this problem. In the very beginning, Orville just kind of tagged along, but eventually the idea of flight became an obsession to the Wright brothers.
The Wrights were, ironically, inspired to study flight by the failure of Otto Lilienthal. During the early 1890s, Lilienthal had designed and flown 16 different hang gliders. The leading aviator in the world, he died in a crash in 1896. The Wrights saw in Lilienthal's death an opportunity to take the lead in airplane development. Wilbur wrote to the Smithsonian Institution requesting, as he put it, all that is already known about flight experiments. Studying the Smithsonian's pamphlets and books, the Wrights formed some basic ideas about flight. Obviously, an aircraft needed wings to provide lift and power to push the craft forward. But the Wrights added a third element, control. Still struggling just to get off the ground, no one but the Wrights ever considered how to steer a plane once it got off the ground.
I think it's not coincidental that they were bicycle manufacturers, because in recognizing this problem of controllability, What was key for the Wrights was turning. And they recognized that turning an airplane is three-dimensional. You have to change the bank of the airplane, and then you have to change the pitch of the airplane, and you have to kick the nose over. It's really a very, very complex maneuver, if you will, if you think of how an airplane actually turns.
The Wrights noticed that birds change the angle of their wings in order to turn. One wing moved down and the other up in perfect unison, controlling all aspects of their flight at once. The movement was simple enough for a bird, but seemed impossible to mechanically reproduce.
Late one evening when Wilbur was tending to the bicycle shop, and the customer came in and he had problems with the inner tube. And the inner tube came in a long pasteboard box. And while Wilbur was talking to the customer, he found himself with his fingers in each one of those corners of the boxes doing this to it, changing the angle, one up, one down of the corners of the box. And it kind of struck him, this might be a good way of basically just retaining balance for level flight.
The Wrights built a biplane kite, their first experimental aircraft to test the idea. Using simple hand controls, they were able to make the kite climb, dive, and turn. They knew that what works in models often doesn't on a larger scale, and decided to build a larger glider, one a man could ride in. They also searched for a suitable place to fly it, a place with predictable and moderate winds. Once again, the Wrights did careful research. They wrote to the Weather Bureau in Washington, requested locations that fit their needs, and were provided with a list. The Wrights then sent another round of letters to people at those locations. The only reply they got was from a postman in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina.
In the letter, he described that there were no trees or grass. All this was just beach, deep sand. There were 4 giant sand dunes like the one you see that where the monument is on to launch gliders off of. Very hard to get here, sailboat to the Outer Banks. Then once you got here, there was nobody around. Privacy, secrecy, isolation, but then they would find here where they couldn't find anywhere else, and that was Southern hospitality, the people.
The Wrights packed up their new, larger glider and headed for Kitty Hawk. The Wrights took their first large-scale glider to Kitty Hawk in late September 1900. They brought with them 3 trunks full of camping equipment and set up a wood-frame tent on the dunes near a station of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. The biplane glider weighed 50 pounds and cost $15 to build. It had a wooden frame covered in tightly woven cotton. The Wrights tested it first as an unmanned kite, carefully recording flight data and making small modifications to improve its performance. After 3 weeks of flying the glider on a string, they enlisted Bill Tate, the local postman who had answered their initial inquiry about Kitty Hawk, to help them carry the glider to the top of a cluster of high dunes called the Kill Devil Hills. Wilbur lay down across the glider's lower wing. Orville and Tate lifted the glider and ran. As the glider started to lift, Wilbur shouted, "Let go!" They did, and Wilbur sailed gracefully down the slope. He had flown. He made about a dozen flights that day, covering a total of perhaps half a mile, with a total flight time of barely 2 minutes. The wing warping system worked. The glider could be controlled. Thrilled with their initial success, the Wrights returned to Dayton, determined to build a bigger and better glider. They studied what little data there was on lift characteristics of different wing designs, most of which came from Lilienthal's experiments. From that, they built the biggest glider ever constructed, with wings 22 feet wide and 7 feet deep. It weighed nearly 100 pounds and featured an improved steering mechanism. They returned to Kitty Hawk in July 1901 and built a wooden shed on the beach to act as their base of operations. The shed was more accommodating than the previous year's tent. However, it was also the only thing about 1901 that was an improvement over 1900. Wilbur did the flying and almost immediately discovered that the giant wings of the new glider didn't provide as much lift as Lilienthal's data promised. The forward elevator, which controlled the up and down motion of the plane, didn't work. The Wrights spent a precious week redesigning and rebuilding the wings and elevator. It helped, but the glider in flight still had a disturbing tendency to spin wildly out of control. In what turned out to be the last manned flight of the year, Wilbur crashed, cutting his face on the elevator and badly damaging the plane. The Wrights left Kitty Hawk depressed and confused. They returned to Dayton facing a gloomy winter and questioning whether man would ever fly.
You find that when you look at the Wright brothers, they clearly understood the aeronautical research and development process as thoroughly or more than anybody in their time period. And the process that they followed to create the world's first successful airplane was a model of how people do research even in the present day.
The Wrights concluded that Lilienthal's data was wrong. If they wanted to fly, they had to throw away the articles and books and generate their own basic understanding of flight. They built a simple wind tunnel, a box 6 feet long with a fan in one end and a window on top. Using machinery designed to manufacture bicycle parts, they crafted model wings out of wax, solder, steel, and tin. They tested different shapes and spent painstaking hours documenting the minutiae of aerodynamics.
They became aware of the entire theoretical underpinnings of flight. They studied and read widely. They created specialized test equipment to validate some of their own ideas, particularly ideas on controllability.
The 1902 glider looked more like a modern airplane than anything to come before it. The wings were flatter, longer, and not as deep as the 1901 model. There were stabilizers in the rear to balance the front elevator and keep the plane from side-slipping. In late summer, the Wrights returned to Kitty Hawk and spent the first few weeks building a large hangar. They improved their living quarters, which took on decidedly homey characteristics in anticipation of a long stay. By mid-September, they had assembled the glider, and a series of short flights gave rise to optimism. On one of the first flights, with Orville at the controls, the glider spun out of control and crashed. They repaired the damage, but the sudden and unexpected banking became a recurring problem. Lying in bed considering the aerodynamic forces that could cause the crashes, Orville concluded that when the glider turned, air pressure built up along the stabilizers. He suggested that they eliminate one of the stabilizers and make the other movable to help the plane turn. The problem disappeared. The Wrights stayed in camp through late October. By the time they returned to Dayton, they had already roughed out the design of their first powered airplane. To build it, they needed a light, powerful engine. They wrote to several manufacturers, but none wanted the job. So, with the help of one of their bicycle mechanics, they built their own. On September 25, 1903, the Wrights and their newly christened flyer arrived at Kill Devil Hills. Static testing revealed critical problems with the propeller axles. They tried several fixes, but in late November, Orville returned alone to Dayton to machine new shafts. He returned on December 11th with new propeller axles and a fresh $1 bill. The bill was from their father, Milton Wright, who told them to use it to pay for the telegram announcing their success. With the plane finally ready to go, the weather failed them. Kitty Hawk, chosen for its prevailing winds, fell dead calm. Impatient, the Wrights and a few locals hauled the flyer to the top of Big Kill Devil Hill. They flipped a coin to see who would fly first. Orville won. The plane rested on a 60-foot rail that served as a runway. Wilbur ran alongside as the flyer moved forward. After a 40-foot run, it lifted off, raised its nose too high, and crashed. It took 2 days to repair the damage to the flyer. The Wrights moved the track back down off Kill Devil Hills and onto the flat sand below. The prevailing winds returned, and on December 17th, they tried again. This time, it was Wilbur's turn. He slid into place atop the bottom wing. Orville stood alongside. Facing a 27-mile-an-hour wind, they started the engine. The plane moved slowly forward. After 40 feet on flat ground under its own power, the flyer lifted off. It stayed in the air for 12 seconds before settling into the sand 120 feet away. The first powered, sustained, controlled flight had been achieved. They moved the plane back to the rail, and Orville took the controls. He too flew 13 seconds, 175 feet. Then Wilbur, 15 seconds, 200 feet. Finally, Orville, 59 seconds, covering 852 feet. The frame of the plane cracked on landing. Man's first day of flight had come to an end. With the plane safely stored in its hangar, Wilbur and Orville walked 4 miles up the beach to the Weather Bureau station at Kitty Hawk. They sent a telegram to their father. "Inform press," the telegram said.
Their brother, Lorne, when they got the telegram in Dayton, went down to the local newspaper, and the local editor read 59 seconds. He said if it had been 59 minutes, it might be newsworthy. The next day in the newspaper, the only thing was mentioned is that the Wright boys will be home for Christmas. Talking about missed the story of the century.
The Wright brothers were not naive idealists. As they had turned their tinkering into small businesses when they were boys, after their first flight at Kitty Hawk, they worked to turn their test craft into a practical flying device. Working at Huffman Prairie, a 100-acre pasture outside Dayton, the Wrights made more than 80 flights in 1904, testing and revising not just their technology, but also their technique.
Theoretically, the machine with the fuel capacity was capable of flying about 8 miles, but they had no skill. So the reason they got better each time they tried it, they just increased on their abilities and their skill as being pilots.
On September 15th, 1904, Wilbur made the first complete circle of the field. In November, he flew 4 circles around Huffman Prairie, staying in the air for 5 full minutes. In the spring of 1905, the Wrights built the Flyer 3, which featured improved flight controls. That summer, they flew more than 40 successful flights. The longest lasted 39 minutes and covered more than 24 miles. The Wrights' test flights turned Huffman Prairie into a significant attraction. The crowds, while gratifying, made the brothers nervous, since they had applied for but had not been granted a patent on their wing warping system.
Now, everything that makes the airplane turn is right in front of you. There's nothing inside the wings or anything like that. So when they went back to Ohio in 1904 and 1905, there were a lot of people hanging out, trying to walk up close to the airplane and see everything works.
Fearing that someone would steal their technology, at the end of the 1905 year, the Wrights put their aircraft under wraps and kept it there. For 2.5 years, they did not fly. During that time, rumors took hold that the Wrights had never flown at all.
There was so much jealousy involved in the invention of the airplane. The Wright brothers were literally unheard of until 1899. And when they went to compete with men who had, quote, higher educated, college training, all the political backing, all the government funding, I think they were kind of resented by these people because of their lack of education.
The Wrights offered their airplane to the United States Army, and the Army declined. The government had spent more than $70,000 on Samuel Langley's failed experiments, and the idea that a couple of bicycle repairmen from Dayton could succeed where the respected Langley had failed seemed absurd. The Wrights persisted. They offered to meet strict specifications if the Army would agree in advance to buy a Wright Flyer if they succeeded. The Army refused to sign a contract until it had seen the plane fly. The Wrights wouldn't fly without the contract. The Wrights continued to work behind closed doors. Without ever testing it, they designed and built the Type A Flyer. In the Type A, the pilot sat upright, and a second seat allowed the plane to carry a passenger. In February 1908, the Army relented and gave the Wrights a contract to deliver an aircraft that could meet what seemed at the time impossible specifications. The plane had to be capable of carrying 2 men 125 miles at an average speed above 40 miles an hour. A month later, the Wrights signed a second contract with a French company to manufacture Flyers in Europe. Only then did the Wrights return to flight. Still concerned about protecting their technology, they returned to Kitty Hawk. Once again in splendid isolation, they practiced in a modified 1905 Flyer, carrying as a passenger a mechanic who had accompanied them from Dayton. At the end of May, Orville returned to Dayton to prepare a Type A flyer for the Army demonstration. Wilbur set sail for France to prepare for demonstration flights there. The Europeans greeted Wilbur with suspicion. On August 8th, in front of a sparse crowd at a small racetrack near Le Mans, Wilbur took off. He circled the track twice and landed smoothly. The flight lasted less than 2 minutes, and the French had never seen anything like it.
It was a mix of admiration, disappointment, shock, almost disbelief. They were measuring flights in terms of yards and meters of length. And here were the Wrights able to produce an airplane that could literally turn figure eights, stay aloft for at least a half hour or much longer than that, exhibit perfect controllability.
Every day, the crowd grew larger. In 6 months, Wilbur made 100 flights and carried more than 60 passengers. He and his airplane became a sensation. While Wilbur was knocking them dead in Paris, Orville staged the first demonstration flight for the Army. On September 3rd, 1908, at Fort Myer, he took an Army officer up for a jaunt around the base parade grounds. For 2 weeks, on opposite sides of the ocean, the two brothers seemed in a kind of competition for who could make the longest flight, who could take up the most passengers, who could draw the largest crowd. On September 17th, the competition ended. Orville, flying with Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge as his passenger, crashed. Wreckage pinned pilot and passenger to the ground. Orville suffered a fractured thigh, cracked ribs, scalp wounds, and back injuries. Selfridge died, becoming the first fatality in the new era of powered flight. 4 days later, flying over France, Wilbur set the world flight endurance record, 1 hour and 31 minutes. This, he said as he got out of the plane, will cheer Orville up.
It's sad that after 1909-1910 time period, we see the Wrights really drop out of the aeronautics business. Wilbur, of course, dies in 1912. But one has the feeling that the Wrights really had reached the end of their creative tether, if you will.
The Wrights flew a few public stunts, including a flight up the Hudson River in New York City. They opened a company to manufacture Wright flyers and concentrated not on research, but on protecting their patents. Exhausted from one of many patent infringement trials, Wilbur contracted typhoid fever. He returned to Dayton too weak to fight, and after 3 weeks at home, died in 1912.
When Wilbur died, part of Orville died too. He lost all interest in the airplane industry. There'd be no more great inventions, no more genius thoughts.
Orville sold his interest in the Wright Airplane Company for $1.5 million. He retired to a mansion on the outskirts of Dayton. He flew for the last time in 1918, as his invention was proving itself on the battlefields of Europe. He was nearly invisible, appearing only occasionally at ceremonies honoring his and his brother's work. He died in 1948 at the age of 76, less than a year after Chuck Yeager became the first man to break the sound barrier. The machine he and his brother had invented had truly changed the world.